Cullen was driving through Ohio to take a vacation, and he owned WQTE in Detroit. And he said he stopped and he called me at a phone booth and said, "Will you come and be our morning man at WQTE in Detroit?" Now, this is a chance to get from the 36th market to the 5th biggest market in the country. I said, "When can I be there?" He said, "Try to be here as quickly as you can." So I gave my notice, packed up the car, went to Detroit. I only lasted there a short time. Yeah, about a year, because I kept talking about how the fenders would fall off of the different cars, not thinking that they manufacture them in Detroit. And on the John Lodge Freeway, I'd say, "Oh, gee," because we didn't have any mobile units to do the traffic, so I made my own up. And I would have this voice out on the freeway with the traffic sounds, yum, 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 and then you'd hear a part of the car fall off. And I'd say, "Oh, gee, that's a fender has just fallen off the rear quarter panel of a Chevrolet." Well, that didn't set too well in Detroit, the automaking industry of the world, so they let me go. That was about a year later. And I headed for Columbus, Ohio, to go back to work at WING in Dayton. And I stopped in there at WTVN in Columbus and sat out there and just thought I'd leave a tape. And the staff was to lunch, and the general manager was in his office and walked out and said, "What are you doing out here?" And I said, "I just wanted to leave you a tape." So he said, "Come in and I'll listen to it with you." I didn't have to go through a program director. See, my whole life has been luck. And so he said, "Come on in." He listened to it. He loved it. He said, "So you've been in Detroit. I'm looking for a morning man. I'm sending you over to the hotel that the Taft family in Ohio owned." And he said, "You will stay there, and we're putting this staff together, and we will feed you and house you and take care of this, and you'll go on the air with us in 1 month." And that's how I got to Columbus, Ohio. I finally came out here only by a fluke that I couldn't get any more work in the mid of winter in Ohio. So I came out to California, and again, it was one of those fluky things. My brother, with whom I was living at the time in Seal Beach, he said, "Why don't you call the radio stations and see?" I said, "They don't want me here. I've called KFWB, I've called KHJ. He said, "Did you call KRLA?" I said, "No, I haven't, but they don't want to talk to me. And I've already taken a job offer at WICE in Providence, Rhode Island." He said, "You're going to hate Providence." I mean, they got a big television show out now, but in those days, it was cold. He said, "You don't want to go there. I'm going to call." So he picks up the phone and calls KRLA. Unbeknownst to any of us, the person who's the receptionist was sick that morning. And so the program director picks up the phone, and he said, my brother hands me the phone, and I told him who I was. I said, "I'm out of work. I'm pretty good. I've got a tape. Would you like to hear it?" And Reb Foster was the guy who answered the phone, and he was the program director. And he said, "We have just lost our weekend man." I can't remember his first name. Kafuri was his last name. And he said, "He's on the air from 6 until midnight on Sundays. Can you come in here?" Because remember now, in those days, conscription was still in. When you got a draft notice, you had to go to report. So he went up to San Francisco. Ultimately, he was 4F. He became 4F, I swear to God to you. But I got the gig. And I went on the air, and the program director and the production director, which was Reb Foster and Dick Moreland, God love his soul, they were listening. And the first things out of my mouth was I played the first record, and it had about an 8-second intro. That's about all. And the 8 seconds started, and I said, "How do you like the show so far?" It's the only words I'd ever uttered in L.A. Well, this cracked the both of them up, and they said, "Hire that guy." So within 3 months, I was on the air 9 to midnight in L.A. Well, they saw the believability of being yourself. I mean, I am a nutcase. I've told you my problems. It's made a great deal of money for me over my career. But if a person is only themselves, people always tell us in this business, just go in and be yourself. But what they don't tell you is go in and be yourself, and here's how. They never do that, and they ought to. And all I did when they told me go in and be yourself is I thought, well, I'm a good storyteller. I mean, I tell a pretty good story. Oh, it's cuckoo, but at least it kind of has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so I think I'll just do that on the air. I'll just tell stories and have a good time, play a little music, get it done in 30 seconds, and that's what I'll do. And it's been the thing that's worked for me ever since. When I was in Dayton, I told you I was at WONE. Some woman listened to me on the air, and she was traveling through Ohio at a motel or a hotel, and she took one of those hotel postcards, and she said, I heard you on the radio. I can't stand all of that hullabaloo. And she spelled a word out. And I went to the dictionary to see if there really was a word, because my name, Hull, is the first of this word. I can't stand all this hullabaloo. So I looked it up, Hullabaloo. It said, a tumultuous uproar, a noise. And I thought, gee, I'll just stick an ER in there. I got it whipped. So I did. I called myself the Hullabalooer. It's stuck ever since. Well, that radio station was simply a giant. And I was just a small part of it, really. You got to remember, he's now deceased, but one of the brightest men in our business was Emperor Bob Hudson. Bob Hudson had these commandos. He really thought he was an emperor. He got himself a Rolls Royce, one of those old gold Rolls Royce, and he got a crown, and he got an ermine robe. He actually began to believe he was the Emperor of California. So he housed himself with all of these commandos, army people, and he would have these vignettes. And following him was a country guy by the name of Ted Quillen. He followed him. Now, Ted came from KFWB. And he had some great lines. First of all, he had a beautiful voice, a great speaking voice, great pipes. And women loved that. And he was in the early morning hours from 10 until, I think, 1, or 9 until noon. And he would say, Mama, at the end of his show, Mama, come get your baby boy. And the women would just, they line up outside the radio station just asking for, here I am, Mama. I've come to get my baby boy. One time, I guess they did, and that was the end of Ted. Following Ted Quillen was Casey Kasem. Now, I don't have to tell you how popular Casey Kasem has become. He's a giant in the industry. And he was a fledgling little disc jockey who told little corny stories. And he would have all these little cards. And he kept building up these stories. And then he put them in one of those Rolodexes. You know what I mean? And he would pull them out. And he would read. And following, he was a giant. And he had a beautiful voice. And then following him, Casey Kasem, was Bob Eubanks. Now, Bob Eubanks has become a killer with the Newlywed Game and all of these other television shows. He's a semi-nutcase. And so it was Bob Eubanks, and then it was me. And then there was a guy that was all nights. His name was Arlen Sanders. And he was one of the weakest links, but it really didn't matter. We'd done all the damage before midnight anyway. We weren't close-knit. We all loved each other, and we all promoted one another, but we didn't have any interaction, such as going out to bars and going to dances and things like that. Everybody had their own little niche. Mine was the Beatles. Casey was those little stories. I beg your pardon, after Casey Kasem was Reb Foster, our program director, and one of the great things that he had going for him, and I've never heard anybody be able to do it before or since, he could do a woman's voice. He had a character called Maud Skidmore. And Maud Skidmore was the crotchetiest person you've ever met in your life. Everything was wrong. You know, she was a malcontent, a female malcontent who found absolutely nothing right with anything at the time. And so therefore he would get into this voice of his, Reb Foster, and he would actually get the microphone in such a way that he would become Reb Foster here, and then he would take on this treacherous woman, and she would become Maud Skidmore. I forgot about him. He was also one of those great shocks. But we didn't really have time to be in others' lives. We had our own families to raise, our own wives, and we had our own dances to make extra money. We had our own little things, so we didn't run around with each other that much. Well, first of all, when I got to LA, I had an engineer. You had a producer if you wanted one to answer the phones for you. Sometimes an intern who was in college trying to get some experience. But you all had a producer if you wanted one. You all had an engineer. So at KRLA and KMPC and KFI and KGBS, all I had to do was point at someone. When I got here, like you say, I had to do it all myself. I had a real training session with myself because you do it all when you get to markets. And it doesn't matter where the market is anymore. Economics have now made it so that no matter how big you are and what market, you're going to be doing most of it yourself. And so you better learn technical equipment real quick. But it's so simple anymore. What helps is you have computers, you use a mouse, you touch something, it sequentially starts everything else. It really isn't that big a deal anymore. When we started, KFWB was the big radio station, and KRLA beat them badly. So badly that they went to all news, and they've been all news since. However, about 4 years into our life cycle there in LA, KHJ came in, and with less talk and more music beat us eventually. But as far as what they make in LA, the salaries were not anywhere near like they are today. I mean, a man who was making $35,000 to $40,000 in 1963 to $100,000 was a person making a lot of money in the industry. When I left, those figures were up to $250,000 a year, and they're up, you know, to some people now higher than that, much higher. But there are those guys that only still make the $35,000 to $45,000 a year, even in major markets, because they just don't have the audience behind them or the charisma that makes them, you know, worth more money. KHJ offered me twice to go over there and take their afternoons because they were struggling to beat us. And so they asked me to come over there, and I cannot remember their names. I met with them, and they offered me a position at about the same money, and I turned them down. And I told John Barrett, who was the manager, what I had done. 6 months later, they came back and doubled his salary. And they told me at that time, if you turn us down now, we will never ask you again. So I said, let me go think about it. Well, I knew what I was going to do. I was going to get back in my car and just go back and tell the boss, which I did. And he said, do you want to take it? And I said, no, I don't. He said, then use my phone and turn him down. So I did. And in front of him, I said, no, I wasn't interested. And they said, you know, this is the last time we will ever call you. And I said, I understand. They never did again. Never. So once you make up your mind that irritates somebody in LA, New York, Chicago, it becomes a different situation. '63, through 1969 the first time.
Yeah.
Then I left and went to KFI. Then I went to KGBS and back to KRLA from 1981 through 85. Then I left again, small stint at other radio station. I can't remember what it was. I got into commercials. I did commercials a lot for a couple of years, and then went back again in 1993 through 95. I believe the years were at KRLA.
Then you came back here to the desert.
Yes, I came to the desert, but not because I was coming to the desert. I was going to run a radio station in Anchorage. They asked me to come up to interview me to run KFQD, a heritage radio station, 50,000 watts, covers all of, Alaska and Canada, heard in Japan. They want me to come up there and run that. So I sell my house. I put my house up on the market on a Friday. It's sold on a Sunday. And we're ready to ship, or they're going to pay for it all, to ship all of our stuff up by boats to Anchorage. When a woman brings and I can tell this story because Pioneer Broadcasting is no longer in existence. She brought forth this memo that said, we will always at Pioneer Broadcasting do our best to elevate from within. Well, she said, if you hire this fella Dave Hull to run this place and you don't give us a chance, then we're going to bring in an attorneys and sue you. And so they called me up and they said, we've got a problem here. And I said, well, I have a problem here. I've sold my house. It's in escrow. There's a couple of more days. It's going to close. And I said, I've got a course of action. And they said to me, well, Dave, you have to do what you have to do. Well, I'm smart enough to know that that woman didn't realize that you sue your employer and you're finished. You're really finished. You've finished any kind of negotiable closeness with those people. So I didn't take it, and I came around calling friends, and Scott Ellsworth was down here in the desert. He said, come on in. I think Larry Collins would like to see you. And so I did, and I got the job. In the course of time, the woman didn't go to Anchorage. They sent her to run Boise, Idaho, and she lasted about 6 months. Dick Moreland, our production director, came to me and he said, have you heard this group called the Beatles? And I said, yeah, I remember them when I was in Columbus, Ohio. I had seen one of their records and didn't think much of them. I didn't really think much of them because the sound was not the best. Their quality of their recording was not the best. Until they got to Capitol, that's the way it was. So he said, well, you're going to become the president of their fan club because we believe they're going to be a hot number. I mean, outside of Elvis, the Beatles are next. And I said, are you really sure? And he said, starting tonight, you better be sure because you're going to become the Beatle fan club president. I said, okay, what does that mean? We'll need fan club cards. He said, they're already working on that. They had already made up their minds. They never contacted me until they'd made up their minds. I said, okay, but if I'm going to be the president, I'm going to be the vice president, the secretary, the treasurer, and the sergeant at arms. I'm going to be it all. And he said, okay, well, whatever you're going to do, then go out and do it. So I began playing the Beatle records and telling everybody I was in charge. Now, I would make up rumors about them. I would make up these rumors because then I would know which rumors were wrong. I mean, I already knew because I made them up. It's not true that Ringo did this or that he ran around here or cracked up his car. None of those things are true. Well, by the morning time, the kids in LA were saying, did you know that Ringo cracked up his car? No, I had said he didn't crack up his car. I was making all this stuff up. But what it did do, it put KFWB into a frenzy. They said, how does this man get all this information? We'll send somebody out to check on these things. And before they could even do that, I'd have 3 or 4 other rumors that I had made up and explained to them that they were not true. And so that lasted for about, well, from 64 really, through 1969. I was considered to be this 5th Beatle. But remember, there were fifth Beatles all over the country. There was a fifth Beatle in New York. There was a fifth Beatle in Chicago. St. Louis had a fifth Beatle. Everybody had a fifth Beatle. So what does this mean to me? There was nothing big about that. However, Bob Eubanks saw how great the Beatles were becoming. And he said, I am going to bring them into the Hollywood Bowl. Now remember, he's part of a group of broadcasters on KRLA. He brought them into the Hollywood Bowl in 64, 65, and 66 into Dodger Stadium and packed these places. And then we knew, you know, it was a phenomenon that no one had ever seen in the music business before. Well, I liked Paul. Paul and I got along very well for the first part of it. And then he learned I was giving their addresses out on the air. And people were writing them right to their secret hideouts. And that didn't set well with him. John was the boss of the group. You know, he was the one who formed the group. And so therefore he and Brian Epstein were close together, working out details of money and things like that with Bob Eubanks. And George was always very quiet and very reclusive. So if anybody ever tells you, oh, I knew George Harrison real well, they're either lying or they're a little tetched. And then Ringo, he wasn't the swiftest guy in the world, but you've got to remember something. This man came from Liverpool, in the worst area of Liverpool, Dingle. Go check it out. Dingle is a place nobody stays in very long. And so he didn't have the quality education that John Lennon did and that Paul McCartney had later on. The Beatles evolved into something enormous. So then I wasn't about ready to do anything except throw myself into it completely. So the Beatles asked me to come down to the Bahamas, stay down there for a couple of weeks, and it really almost went into 3 weeks while they were filming the motion picture Help. And they were doing these scenes with this really weird stuff, splashing red paint all over Ringo, and myself and Paul McCartney and John Lennon sat in the sand, and we talked about life, death, girls, humanity, the world, hunger, and the tape recorder was going, and these things became classics. Classic information that we were feeding back to an audience in LA. It was, nobody else could do that because, first of all, George had found a dog. And so he walked, I told you he was reclusive. He took the dog and walked around the island. He didn't have much to do with this. And there was a disc jockey in New York that was the fifth Beatle there. I can't remember his name. Big name in the business. That'll show you. You know, it's going. But he was invited down too. But instead of sitting down with a tape recorder, he wanted to be in the movie. He wanted to be an extra in the movie so he could tell his fans he was in the Beatle movie Help. And because of that, I got all the interviews, got all the great stuff, while he was carrying a spear. Derek Taylor was the road manager of the Beatles, the man right underneath Brian Epstein. But you got to remember, he was more than that. He was a fine journalist in England. So he could take a word or two and blow it into a great promotional piece for the Beatles. He was one of the reasons why they were so big in the world, was Derek Taylor. Derek didn't like me at first. Oh, he wasn't very trusting of many people. You know, he just didn't, we were Americans. And to the British, even though we've been very loyal to one another, he didn't really trust me. And besides that, I had a butch haircut. So they didn't trust that either, you see? And they had long moppy hairdos, and I had a butch haircut, and Derek didn't take to me right away. But by the time we were finished with our many years working with the Beatles, we had offered Derek a job. and he became one of our disc jockeys on the weekends first, and then he evolved into something pretty good because he had that British accent, and it gave the radio station, he did promotions and things like that, air promotions and promos, and it gave the radio station a real feeling of British proper, you know, when we needed it most because of cuckoos like me. Well, radio is, you know, there are some people in the business that have to be on the air right up to the time they keel over. I'm one of those people, unfortunately. You know, I have trouble giving it up.
Why?
Because if I give it up, then I can't communicate. I'd have to go home and do shtick with my wife, and she doesn't like me that much to begin with because she's put up with this for nearly 40 years. So you can understand, you know, she says, why don't you go find a place for you where you can talk? And then you have to remember something too. People think we're extroverted. I mean, they look at me now and they say, boy, this guy is a nutcase and he must be very extroverted. We're not. When you think about it, disc jockeys and radio personalities are introverted. They go to work daily in a studio the size of a broom closet and they talk to themselves for 4 hours. Now, how much is that being introverted? We really are introverted. And so if we begin to have a one-on-one situation like you and I are doing, then for the first time I can express myself without being frightened. You know what I mean? If I had to get up in front of a large group, oh, I could do it. I could do it. Sure. I've done it for years. But my heart still pounds. When I go to work, my heart doesn't pound. I'm in a broom closet all by myself. To be serious for a moment, we all are. We're just enough to where we don't push ourselves over the edge. But if you can talk to the microphone by seeing a person in your mind, then you're not talking down to people. You're talking to a person you're seeing, and the person that's listening believes you're talking to them because they're the only ones listening. It's got to be that you're talking to them. So a person who really wants to become a major personality in radio today cannot talk down. He can't talk to that microphone. He has to talk to somebody in his mind and just relate to them and tell stories, and he'll win. Okay, well, you have to understand, Bob would show up at these different appearances in a Rolls Royce wearing an ermine robe. He had this ermine cape, and he had this crown. So wherever he would go, he actually began to believe he was the Emperor of California. And you know, there's a certain madness that comes with being an air personality. If you actually begin to believe that you are that person, something goes wrong with you. I mean, you begin to believe that. He did. He didn't like doing things that would put him in the position of having to demonstrate athletic ability. Now, our radio station had the KRL Apes. We were a basketball team that would come out for any reason at all. Somebody stubs their toes, we would come out and put on a charity event for them. It was all for a good cause because none of us got paid and the charity got an enormous amount of money. If it was schools, colleges, high schools, if it was just for a benefit, we put these people into the weirdest looking basketball uniforms you ever wanted to see. And we'd take their varsity on. We couldn't win. We couldn't possibly win, but we could pack the house. So they all wanted Bob Hudson, and he refused to go because he had no real athletic ability. Oh, he was a comedian, a great one, but really couldn't do diddly when it came to hitting a ball or throwing anything or anything. And so they decided we're going to feed him the ball the last shot of a game. And he got the ball and threw it up at about mid-court, and it swished through and we won the ball game. Well, the people went nuts. Emperor Hudson had, and it made the newspapers. Oh my God. Of all of the Southern California newspapers said, Bob Hudson wins the first game ever for the KRL Apes. It was a fluke. It was a total fluke. He was supposed to throw it over the backboard. He threw it into the basket. We won by 1 point. He never performed again. Never. Because he said, I can't do that again, and I'm leaving on top. Well, Wolfman was one of those so different people. He too was a madman. Oh yeah, he was mad, but he started in Del Rio, Texas. That's where his real popularity began, on a huge radio station just over the border. And he would sell little statues of Jesus. And you would send in your money, and they wouldn't pay him to do the commercials. They would pay him by the response they got. So if he got a lot of mail, then they'd pay him a little more. If he got no mail, he worked that night for free, you know. But he developed one thing that a lot of us have never developed, and that is salesmanship. He could get behind a microphone and sell you anything. Wolfman Jack could do that. And he started there. He went on to become one of the real, I guess, radio's real nutcase, because he shouted. And then everybody tried to sound like him. You know, everyone wanted to imitate Wolfman. And then so Wolfman became a caricature himself. And then the big thing for Wolfman was the movie. The movie American Graffiti. Thank you. And that made him a star, really a star. It made a lot of other people stars too. We lost him. And there was one thing I always thought about Wolfman Jack. If an emergency happened, war broke out in this country, or a terrible natural disaster, people would not turn to Wolfman Jack for the news. Because, say, baby, doesn't work when you've got a huge disaster going. So I thought to myself, okay, if you can get a little nutty like him, but still stay a little bit sane, people will come to you in case there is a natural disaster. You know, they at least will respect you a little bit. I mean, you have to have something that's different than everybody else, or you become part of the general population. So with the Hullabalooer, that was who wants to be that? Wolfman Jack, who wants to wear a beard and have his hair look like that? So it sets you apart. Having something like that sets you apart. And if people begin to imagine you as being set apart, then you're above the fray. And that, I think, is the reason why people should get a moniker, something that's different than anybody else. Well, I've had people send me letters, or people meet me in personal appearances, and they say, oh my God, I didn't know you looked like this. I mean, I thought you were a fat blonde. In those days, I was thin, slim fella with dark hair. And so they would walk away saying to themselves, I don't know if I like him that much anymore. Do you see? Because people build in their own mind, because we're an industry, we're theater of the mind. So if they have an image of you, don't go out there and spoil it. Because then they're going to say, oh gee, I don't know if I like him as well. My relationship with fans when I was a young man was teeny, you know, they were teenagers, teeny boppers. And so they had a different sense of screaming and hollering, and the adulation was something wonderful. But that's changed now. You'd never hire me to go out and promote Eminem. I mean, let's face it, this is a geezer person here now working. So you have to remember, I've gone to an older audience as well. And you have to remember that that audience goes to bed at 9:15. So even though I'm a nutcase from 6 to 9, I start really tapering off at 9 o'clock at night because half of them have gone to bed. And the radio is playing across the room, but they don't want to be disturbed anymore. Well, now I'm into a different era. Now we have the semantics police, the pronunciation police. Oh, they get on the phone. They tell me if I mispronounce something right away. There's the informational police. They want to make sure that that information that I tell today is accurate. So they want to put in a little bit of their knowledge too. I don't answer the phones anymore. Because I had 5 children and a wife at home in Arcadia. When you let the fan adulation go to your head, you may as well just run a line through yourself. You're finished. You cannot take this stuff seriously because it isn't going to last. And you'll go mad when it goes away. You got to be flexible enough to where you know that I was a teenage rock and roll disc jockey at one time. I'm an adult playing adult beautiful music in the valley. And if people listen and hear my stories, which are totally different than the stories I used to tell as a younger man, they still appreciate me because I'm still different than anybody else. I've been waiting to play this kind of music all of my career. You know, some rock and roll gets so outlandish, and especially today with rap music and the lyrics, I don't know how they'd put up with it. So I came along to the Valley at exactly the right time. I mean, my age, we may sound 45 through 55 on the air, which is the demographic we're going after. But look at me. I'm old. You gotta like what you're doing in life. I don't care if it's somebody that sits there with a jackhammer. If he doesn't like it, it's work. If he loves doing what he's doing, then it's a career. I love what I'm doing, and it's my career. It's not a job. And first of all, you gotta remember I'm working for a very honest company that have built with wonderful people who care about one another. And I've been very fortunate during my career to be involved with just about every radio station I've worked for has had wonderful, warm people. Well, I think I already really said that. You got to be yourself. My advice to everybody is to imagine that microphone as that glass up against the wall in the apartment. Just talk as if it's just listening to you, and let people become your voyeurs, and they'll love you for it. You know, the audience that I have today really is warm and comfortable with themselves, and I'll tell you why. They've all raised their families, and so have I. They all now have grandkids and great-grandkids, and so do I. There's a difference about what they listen to and what appeals to them anymore. You know, I have an idea about why we as grandparents get along so well with our grandkids. And how come the grandkids love their grandparents so much? It's simply because the grandkids and the grandparents have a common enemy: the grandparents' kids.